this gathering convened for the UN Food System Summit Science Days as a side event at the invitation of Joachim von Braun, the chair of the scientific group of the UN Food System Summit. And he asked the International Agricultural Economics Association and the African Agricultural Economics Association to convene agricultural economists to have a conversation about what economists can offer to the Food System Summit and to food system transformation generally. So that's what this conversation is about. I want to start by putting up just a little poll for us to make sure we have a sense of who's on the call. Thank you so much for taking the time, the attention to talking with us today. We're collecting the demographic information about who's on the call to inform the UN Food System Summit dialogues. These are independent dialogues hosted by groups like the International Ag-Econ Association and the African Ag-Econ Association to talk about food transformation, food system issues. And I think a conversation with economists that we're going to have today is like particularly useful. So the invitation came to economists because, of course, economists study how people respond to incentives in production, in food choice, and perhaps above all, interacting with each other in markets. And so we study markets. We have a lot to say about food prices and incentives to farmers, incentives to food manufacturers and traders, and incentives for food choice and diet quality, and ultimately nutrition and health. Really interesting conversation. So to have this, I think people have, so please do enter in the poll a bit of demographic information about yourself so that we can report back on who was part of this conversation. And please type in the chat box your name, the country, and if you'd like, your institutional affiliation, so that we can begin that conversation with you. And I'll be asking you, please enter in the chat box any comments, questions, thoughts you have, because the panelists will be sharing some very interesting ideas to start us off, but it's ultimately about you, about in your country, in your institution, what do you as an economist or someone possibly working with economists think about prices, markets, and incentives for farmers, food companies, and consumers for food choice. So I see some are students, some are faculty members, some are in government, and we have all of that on the panel. So Rachel, if you could share the first slide just to emphasize what we're doing here. So we'll have opening remarks from Lele, from the president of the International Association of Agricultural Economists. As you must know, Lele has had a remarkable career in agricultural economics and applied economics generally, and is the president-elect of the International Association and is about to host the 31st International Conference of Agricultural Economists in August. So if you haven't received any notices about that conference, I would encourage you to keep an eye out for those notices to register and participate. Next, we'll have Blaise and Nkamleu, who is the current president of the African Association of Agricultural Economists working at the African Development Bank. And he'll be presenting remarks on the role of the African Association and of agricultural economists generally on the continent. And then we have two agricultural economists working in universities with extraordinary track records of work with governments, with researchers in other disciplines to take economics to agriculture, food, and nutrition across the spectrum of aspects of the food system that the Food System Summit is talking about. So J.D. Meenakshi, economist at the Delhi School, who has worked for a long time with the CGIAR in Africa, across South Asia, really remarkable. Thank you very much, Meena, for joining us. And then Daniel Sarpong, who is an economist in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness at the University of Ghana in Legon, but has been serving as dean, so remarkable experience across the School of Agriculture and the University of Ghana, but also work with the Ghanaian government and work on the high-level panel of experts convened by the United Nations. So a lot to say about, and particularly about food prices and markets. And then our last panelist will be Anna Herforth, who is a PhD in nutrition, but has been collaborating with economists, with myself, with Daniel, with others over about 6 or 7 years, thinking about how to understand food prices, food markets in terms of nutrition. And that will, I hope, provide a lot of food for thought for us for conversation in the chat box. So thanks very much to all of the panelists. So I'll now just share the results of the poll. As you can see, this is a group that's 57% male. That's, I would say, fairly typical of this sort of gathering. Nutrition tends to be more female, agriculture more male, interesting mix of people. Looking across sectors, we have a very nice balance, I think, across different groups. And in terms of the fourth part of the questionnaire of the poll on the stakeholder groups, the largest group, of course, is science and academia, but at least a quarter, probably a third in government and the UN system and so forth. So thank you very much to everybody for entering the poll, for your introductions in the chat box. And I'm really delighted to be able to hear now from Lele.
Thank you very much, Will. First and foremost, I want to thank Will for taking the lead in organizing this. I was asked by Joachim van Braun to organize a session like this, and I've been so preoccupied with the meeting of the International Association of Agricultural Economists, which for the first time we are having to do completely online, which was not the case. As you know, the 91 plus tradition of the IAAE is to have a big in-person conference, and we couldn't do it this time, which was scheduled in India. So it was a big challenge to organize something online, and that has been keeping me very busy, combined with a book that I'm just publishing from Oxford on food for all. Will kindly agreed to co-host and co-manage this exercise. So I'm very grateful to him, and of course to the African Agricultural Economic Association that agreed to participate together with Tufts University in this ambitious exercise on the subject of food prices and economics' role in economics' role in the food systems transformation, something that many of us have been working on over the years. So I'm just going to speak a little bit and make an advertisement for the International Association's meeting, which is going to be held from August 17 to August 31st. This time it's a 2-week conference rather than a week one that is done intensively by IAAE because of the time changes and the challenges we have in dealing with the membership that is in all parts of the world. And I think that's one of the challenges I'm currently dealing with in scheduling the program for the conference. So we have 8 plenaries, 27 invited sessions, 39 symposia, 563 contributed papers which were reviewed and selected through double-blind reviews. And so there is a huge variety of topics that we are dealing with in the conference. And I hope all of you join the conference. It is, because it's an online conference, it doesn't cost much. So that is another advertisement I wanted to make sure I have registered. And so the registration is still open, and I urge you to participate. So the ambition of the UN Food Summit is very substantial. It is not only addressing issues of meeting SDGs, but also addressing number of goals related to climate change. And many of our papers in the plenaries are going to be dealing with these issues in considerable depth. So I'm giving you a bit of an introduction to the plenaries, which include the first and most important plenary is building back better food systems from the COVID experience. And number of very good panel members are going to talk about this. In addition to that, we have received quite a large number of contributed papers on the COVID experience in different parts of the world. So, and its responses of different countries to it. Then we have an important session on agriculture, food systems, and health, which looks at the interaction between food systems, population growth, and the transitions in dietary patterns and its implications for health. Another important plenary session we have is on trade policy. And yesterday I was in a session on trade issues with WTO, and you know, there is considerable amount of uncertainty on trade, trade environment, but also a general view among economists that we need an open trading system. And fortunately, in the COVID experience, the world trading system has been much better behaved compared to 2007, 2008. So we'll have very good discussion on those issues. Then we have a session on making irrigation sustainable, because as you know, in many parts of the world, water use has become completely unsustainable. And the question is, what kind of strategies are countries and regions using to make water use more sustainable over time? Then we have a major session on climate change, which addresses what kind of evidence we need in order to deal with agricultural policy making in the context of climate change and uncertainty in production, supply, and its implications for demand and consumption. Then we have a session on digital technologies and the new opportunities that are provided in agriculture as a result of it. We have a session on SDGs and its challenges and opportunities to see how much, what have countries accomplished in hunger and malnutrition. As you know, because of COVID, challenges have increased, and there are several following sessions on the measurement issues that we face in different parts of the world to know um, how SDGs are or are not being realized. So there is a long list of papers that I could be sharing with you, but I'm going to suggest that you all look at the program, which will be, the plenaries are already on the web. The rest of the program will be on the web sometime very soon. The conference starts from August 17th and goes on until August 31st, because of having to plan sessions every day to suit the time availability in different parts of the world. I've been consulting number of our members to see how to schedule it. I think an important part of what we are doing is we formed a committee on women in agricultural economics. I was the first woman to be elected to be president of International Association, and I realized that we need to do a lot more on getting women participating more actively. And we have a very interesting paper being presented by two prominent women ag economists that addresses the question of how do women analyze agriculture compared to men. And basically, as Will was suggesting earlier, it suggests that women address different issues, and therefore the scope of agricultural economics has changed considerably as women's participation in agricultural economics has increased. So that is a session that you will find quite interesting. We are also forming thematic groups in IAAE, and we've received tremendous amount of enthusiastic uh, interest from members to say they would like to join thematic groups. So again, I urge you all to get involved in the association and be very active. And I think what we are doing today is very relevant, not just to the UN summit, but also how can we as professionals help build capacity in countries which will require much more analytical capacity to address the complex issues that the UN Food Summit is posing as major ambitions for the profession. So thank you very much for giving me this chance to say something about IAAE, and thank you for Will for organizing this, and I look forward to the rest of the session.
Thank you so much, Uma. So I put in the chat box the link to the conference. Definitely have a look. You'll see very rich conversations there. And if any of you have experience with the IAAE or previous international conferences, please do enter in the chat any reflections you might have on the value of that association. It's been a very important home for me professionally over the years. I was fortunate to be editor of the association's journal for a time, and it's really wonderful to see it in such good hands with Uma and to have such a rich meeting coming up in August. We now have Blaise Nkamleu, who is currently president of the African Association and has a few slides to share. So Blaise.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Will. While waiting for the slide to come, I thank you for this occasion to present some of my thoughts on the food prices in Africa. I will be focusing on the continent with an African look on the food prices. What I'm trying to do is just to throw down a few thoughts back and then have a conversation this morning. So next slide. We know food prices in Africa usually need to be seen in relation and in association with nutrition, because in more developed countries, for example, when you talk about food prices, this can be linked to food processing, this can be linked to all sorts of things. But in Africa, again, we are still at a stage where a large amount of revenue of population are dedicated on nutrition. So food prices is directly linked to how population are able to feed themselves, and this is really related to the poverty that is observed on the continent. Next slide. We see it sometimes when we approach poverty in Africa, we can approach it in different sort of way. But usually, again, as I said, with an African look, poverty again is about food on the table. You have it or you don't have it. So when looking at the price, we have to put it in relation to how people are able to feed themselves and the consequences of this, because those who are not able to feed themselves because of the food prices increasing, for example, these people are more susceptible to diseases because they can feed themselves well. They have more diseases, and one consequence also is that their earning potential will decrease just because they can feed themselves well and they can treat themselves well, and because the earning potential decrease, also the family can be stuck in a poverty in the sense that they cannot, for example, send children to school and all sorts of things. So and this is locking the families in a kind of intergenerational cycle of poverty, and all this goes from prices. And I'm trying to hang the prices, as I say, with the overall economic environment. Next slide. So when we see also, we also need to have prices and put it together with the social stability on the continent. If most of you will remember, in 2008, we have had what we call food prices spike and food prices crisis in Africa, where in many countries there were a lot of disorder because the prices for main food, particularly rice, suddenly rise. This one was very much visible. But beyond the one, there are many other small causes that are somehow can be linked to the food prices on the continent. Even though sometimes we see another explanation, you will see many turbulence going on on the continent today can be linked at least partly to the unavailability of food, and which is also linked to the prices of food, which is going up. And when food prices increase, people don't have food to eat, and this can create all sort of turbulence and create all sort of conflict between people or between ethnics. Next slide. So basically, food prices it has implication that goes beyond just nutrition and can impact all the social stability. And sometimes it starts with food prices, yes, but at the end it will end up being ethnic classes or religious classes, as we see in many part of the country. So many population who cannot afford food because prices are going up, they find themselves like being excluded. They find themselves, viewing themselves as if they are excluded from the society. And those who are excluded are now very prone to easily be recruited into violence groups and becoming, at the end, the issue will be put down as ethnic classes or even religious classes, but part of them start with lack of food, with simply poverty, lack of food, or price of food being very high. So, and next slide, food prices then is viewed is more strategic than it seems, and this is a call that we have to put on the table and call policymakers to be more strategic in handling food prices, because handling food prices is not only handling the nutrition, it's the faith of the society, all the society, which is sometimes at stakes when the food prices are not handling properly. And one good cause of this, as far as the country is concerned, is really the low agricultural productivity. If we don't put sufficient effort to raise the productivities, we will be having from time to time food price spike, which with all the consequences that I just mentioned. So it is very important to continue to work on the options that help the sector, the agricultural sectors, which in turn will also help to stabilize prices and make food be affordable to the population. Next slide. This is part of the work that the association, the African Association of Agricultural Economics, is doing. And we have been trying for many years now to mobilize energy and intelligence to advise authority on the continent and also the partners who are helping or trying to help the sectors. So the association has a mandate on the continent, and as some of you here know, we all triennial conferences and publish professional journals, and also we have from time to time policy activities. But the most important is the journal of the Agricultural and Resource Economics, which is the journal of the association, and where we try to publish the research and result of our not only of our members, but all the agricultural economists on the continent, as we are trying to bring all the knowledge that we have on the continent. And once we have all those results, we are doing most policy activities with the aims to try to influence the policymaker to understand how they can use the result of the research of the analysis to change the course of things as far as the sector, the agricultural sector is concerned. Maybe this is the occasion for me to also advertise the association and ask to those who are participating to this meeting and who are not yet members of the association to come close to the association and help us to continue the good work the association has been doing on the continent. I will stop there. It was just a few thoughts that to launch the debate, and we can continue discussion depending on the area that participants would like us to put more weight. Thank you, Will.
Wonderful. Thanks, Blaise. And yes, I just want to endorse the African Association's, first of all, the website, the newsletter, really tremendous convening power across the continent. And I'm especially glad to be able to have this conversation now between members of the African Association and members of the International Association, especially people in South Asia. I think there's no better kind of exemplar of the opportunities for people in South Asia, especially in India, to work across the Indian Ocean to Africa. Then Meena, J.V. Meenakshi is a professor of economics at the Delhi School of Economics, really in the top ranks of research on how household behavior, farm technology adoption, technology innovation affects nutrition. Professor Meenakshi has done really extraordinary work with the CGIAR system, and then most recently with the Standing Panel on Impact Assessment, thinking about how CGIAR technologies, including especially biofortification, have influenced livelihoods and nutrition. So, Meena?
Thank you very much, Will, and I really want to express my gratitude to both Uma and to Will for inviting me to be a panelist and to give me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. Before I begin, however, I also want to put a plug for the Journal of the International Association of Ag Economists. I was privileged to serve as one of its associate editors until recently. The journal is called Agricultural Economics. And I would, since I see there is a lot of PhD students and active researchers among the audience, I would like to say that it's headed by a fantastic group of editors, and I would encourage you to submit your work to this journal. So thank you for giving me a minute to say that. I want to maybe pick up where Blaise left off and try and talk about what we as agricultural economists bring to the table. Some of the linkages that are highlighted in this very simple graphic are things that he has mentioned, but maybe worth reiterating. So we do believe that we need to look at the system as a whole, and we have traditionally believed that if we have enough agricultural production and enough diversity in agricultural production, and agriculture is practiced in an environmentally sustainable manner, that will somehow automatically translate into adequacy of diets, that people have enough food to eat, and that they also have nutritious food to eat. And that in turn will have positive consequences for the health and well-being of all peoples, not just a few, which in turn has a feedback loop into the agricultural ecosystem. This is a very simplistic representation of some very complex ideas, but it's worth reiterating, say, that agricultural economists have a large role to play in what otherwise seems to be the domain of plant scientists, nutritionists, and the medical community, which is to provide the linkages and the trade-offs that often occur because these linkages don't seem to work. They're very rarely unidirectional, and often they're not solid lines. The reason they're dashed lines is they don't seem to always work in the way that we expect. And part of the reason lies in whether there is a supporting policy environment that cuts across the system as a whole. It also depends on whether there are data systems in place to support informed policy making. Next slide. So along these many pathways, There are, of course, several challenges, and it's not my intent in this short period of time to highlight all of them. But I do want to give an example of where some of these pathways may indeed break down and may not even be dashed in nature, but simply not connect. And one of these is access to fresh water, which is critical to each of these buckets that I had presented in the previous slide, which is predicted to get more scarce, as Umar had mentioned, and also more variable with climate change, both regionally and temporally. So what we as agricultural economists bring to the table is to try and help address their challenges and their implications for the achieving of sustainable development goals, what the UN website itself refers to as sustainable goals integration. And the key set of tools that we bring to the table involve evaluating trade-offs that may be implicit in achieving better outcomes for all. So for example, there may be a trade-off between managing the water footprint, using water sustainably, using water in a safe manner, and the implications that has for what we consider healthy diets and in general, an improvement in welfare for all. And prices that Blaise referred to are often a key metric that help us evaluate these kinds of trade-offs. As many of you know, in South Asia, there are water markets. There are markets that mediate who has access to groundwater and who's able to purchase groundwater for cultivation and therefore be able to sustain their livelihoods. These markets are often unregulated, informal, and yet have larger social consequences. So what do we really understand about how these water markets operate within agriculture? There is similarly a market for water in food. Do we actually have enough food is one question, but also important is, do we have enough water to drink? And indeed, the experience of many cities, certainly in India, in the initial onslaught of the COVID pandemic, was that it was easier to ensure that people had some food. It was a lot more difficult to ensure that people had access to drinking water, which was of adequate quality. So prices can help us mediate and understand these linkages and perhaps provide incentives by which we can influence policies. A lot of these challenges also involve what we as economists term as externalities, because there are consequences of use in other sectors of the economy that perhaps are not visible and are often hidden. There may be opportunity costs to use of a resource that are not apparent in a market price. So as economists, we can help uncover these costs and internalize them in the metrics that we use. And we can also look at distributional consequences in a way that plant scientists cannot do, in a way that nutritionists perhaps are not equipped to deal with, and in a way certainly that the medical community may not be able to deal with. So we think of this as a system. What we bring to the table is an ability to treat this as a system and recognize the role of incentives, be they in the form of prices or other incentives to induce change in resource use so that it is actually sustainable and equitable. One very good example of this involves using pricing metrics to compute the real costs of a healthy diet. And that is something that some of my co-panelists will address after me. And so it's my pleasure to turn it over to them, and to also, I look forward to hearing your feedback on how you believe the agricultural economics community can help achieve this transformation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Excellent framing and segues, leads very nicely into comments from Daniel Sarpong at University of Ghana, Legon.
Thank you very much, Will, for the kind words and my gratitude for the invitation to be part of this conversation. By way of starting my presentation, I would like to say that the previous speaker, Professor Meenakshi, has highlighted on several of the critical things that we as economists must be looking at in terms of the nexus between agriculture, food, and health. The role of the economist, agricultural economist, whether the University of Ghana or other universities, is to work with people from other backgrounds and policy practitioners in agriculture, nutrition, to influence policy on the emerging food systems. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a collaborative effort in agriculture, nutrition, and health. And I title this the Policy Dialogue for Use of New Food Price Indices to Track Cost of Nutritious Diets in Ghana. So I'm going to be speaking on policy dialogue for use of new food price indices to track cost of nutritious diets in Ghana. And my objective is to share an outcome of a specific collaborative research project and how dialogue between the project economists and policy practitioners can help improve the understanding of metrics for agriculture, food, and nutrition linkages. Next slide, please. For the last 6 years, there are two specific collaborative research projects that I want to highlight. And this is the indicators of the affordability of nutritious diets in Africa, what we call YANDA, and changing access to nutritious diets in Africa and Southeast Asia, CANDASA. Here, I want to emphasize on the collaborations with colleagues at Tufts University, with colleagues in IFPRI, and with colleagues in Malawi and Tanzania. So the affordability of nutritious diets in Africa, it's okay, you can leave it here. The affordability of nutritious diets in Africa aimed at mainstreaming new metrics in Ghana's food price monitoring institutions, and it was the same for Tanzania. Whilst CANDASA was looking at what is the cost of a nutritious diet, and we're looking at new price indices that could reveal changes in affordability of foods and nutrients. New slide, next slide, please. Now, the two projects, the YANDA and CANDASA, share a common vision. That is food prices that reflect nutritious diets and estimating the cost of a nutritious diet using new price indices developed to reveal changes in affordability of foods and nutrients. Next slide, please. Now, in the first collaborative project, the YANDA, where we envision that food prices must reflect nutritious diets, we focus on reviewing the existing market food price data, the data collection mechanism, and the content in the context, as well as the agencies involved. In Ghana, we have the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, we have the Ghana Statistical Service, we have private data collectors, ESOCO, we also have GAPTO. GAPTO is the Ghana Agricultural Producers and Traders Organization. All these entities collect market food price data for their different purposes. So the problem, if you take the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, they collect prices of many foods in one or more markets in every district in Ghana, at least once per week. And they report this data. Now, the problem and the shared solution is that food availability, the price that they collect, is mostly focused on starchy staples and calories. And the prices that are collected are less available for diverse foods, most lacking in diets. And the existing food price indices are not based on nutritious diet. So after a review of food price data in Ghana and the status of MoFE's food price data collection, the first project, the YANDA, enhanced MoFE's food price data collection to reflect nutritious diets. Next slide, please. Now, one big lesson we learned in this exercise was that the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, Ghana Statistical Service, and the other private stakeholders were all in agreement. So there was a big buy-in in this exercise. We all agreed that food security also means access to nutritious foods to meet dietary needs. So firstly, we realized that we were missing a comprehensive data on key food prices, and that was dark green leafy vegetables, diverse fruits and vegetables in general, dairy, and many others that cover all the food groups. And more importantly, we were missing a statistic that covers the price of a nutritious diet. We also realized the difficulty in formulating any informed policies and programs towards food and nutrition security without data showing the problem areas. Next slide, please. So with guidance from nutritionists, the food price data that is collected should cover these minimum dietary diversity for women. So the most important thing is that the food price data collected should have diversity. So we should have data that covers grains, white roots and tubers and plantains, pulses, nuts and seeds, dairy, meat, poultry and fish, eggs, dark green leafy vegetables, other vitamin A rich foods and vegetables, other vegetables, other fruits. So what IANDA, next slide please. So what IANDA, the first project did was to help the Ghana Ministry of Food and Agriculture expand their price monitoring and collect additional data. So what the project did was to encourage the Ministry of Food and Agriculture to collect additional data, those that you see in red. So Bambara, melon seeds, contomere, this is green, dark green leafy vegetables, jute mallow, alefu, and then with the meat and poultry, we lack data on fresh fish, chicken meat, snail, goat meat, mutton, and on vegetables, we lacked data on cabbage, and so on. So what the project did was to help the Ministry of Food and Agriculture collect additional data that reflects diversity in the food prices that are collected. Now, it does not mean that Ghanaians were not eating these missing food items, but that there were no formal existing data for these. So Ghana's MOFA market price now reports include these additional foods that are marked in red for all major markets. Next slide, please. Now, the second challenge was the need to fill a data gap of computing a statistic that covers price of a nutritious diet. And this was filled by the Kandasa project. Next slide, please. So we used data that were collected by the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, and this covered 70 monthly observations from March 2009 to December 2014. And using new indicators that were developed by Kandasa, we developed some food price, some statistic to measure the cost of nutritious diet. Next slide, please. So in the Kandasa, we developed several measures of cost of a nutritious diet. We developed what we call the nutritious or nutrient CPI, the cost of dietary diversity, the cost of recommended diet, and then the cost of nutrient adequacy, CONA. So for policy analysis in Ghana, we computed the cost of nutrient adequacy, which is the least cost combination of foods to meet nutrient requirements. Now, the Ghana Statistical Service was very much interested in using the nutrient CPI. Now, next slide, please. So as already said, the Kona is the least cost diet at each market, returning the minimum cost of buying enough nutrients for an average adult woman each day. So we use 17 of the 21 essential nutrients, omitting vitamin D and cholesterol because they are naturally synthesized by the body, and omitting iodine and molybdenum due to lack of data in the food composition database. So in Ghana and with that data set, achieving nutrient adequacy at lowest cost will require eating a kilogram of mango, which is 900 grams per day, and a quarter kilogram of soya beans, 250 grams per day. This is unrealistic. So that's required that the additional nutrient-dense foods have to be collected to be able to have a more comprehensive analysis on the costs of a nutrient adequacy. Next slide, please. So with that data, please, next slide. Yes, so with that data set, the cost of a nutrient adequacy diet at baseline was computed as USD 2.33 per average woman per day. What we did was we did several simulations by changing the food groups in terms of price, average prices, and so on. Now, what I'm reporting here is the price changes we observe in fruits and vegetables, and they have the greatest impact on the cost of nutrient adequacy in Ghana. For a 10% price decrease, the median Kona decreases by 5% from USD 2.33 to USD 2.21. Next slide. So with these analysis and background and interactions, since 2016, the Yanda and the Kandasa project has worked with Ghanaian authorities to help officials use new price indices for policy analysis and program management. There is, however, concern about how the data will be interpreted. So to do this, Kandasa proposed creation of an informal nutritious food price analysis support group to be hosted at the University of Ghana's Institute for Statistical, Social, and Economic Research. Now, this was to allow government statistical officers to meet regularly with local economists and other stakeholders before and after the release of new data to discuss the significance and interpretation of each indicator. But for COVID-19 disruptions, I guess by now the Ghana Statistical Service would be churning out either quarterly or annually this cost of nutrient adequacy in Ghana. Next slide, please. Now, the objective to emphasize was for the Ghana Statistical Service to compute and release periodically a cost of affordable diet, similar in structure to the annual consumer price index that statistical offices elsewhere release. Ghana has demonstrated that existing food price data monitoring systems can be used with very little added cost to provide better information for nutrition impact. In this sense, it will pave way for other national statistical offices to adapt, adopt, and release same. Now, I know that in the next presentation by Dr. Herforth, she'll be elaborating more on what has been done in other countries and the experiences that are shared in this direction. Once again, well, I would like to thank you for the opportunity and thanks for the audience. Thank you very much.
Excellent. And I would just underscore that in addition to this project, Daniel has done a lot of remarkable things. I mentioned the HLPE convened by the UN and many other initiatives. So Anna Herforth, as I mentioned, did a PhD in international nutrition but has been working on this question of food environments. And is it possible for the public health community to understand the drivers of the commercial environment, sometimes called the commercial determinants of health, the businesses that influence what is available and especially what isn't available? And it began with just amazing fieldwork about the African indigenous vegetables that are so often absent from marketplaces. And as you just heard from Daniel Sarpong, the Ghanaian statistical system, the GSS, and also the MOFA, the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, beginning to collect data on green leafy vegetables in a more richer way to inform this research. So Anna has a long history of working with economists, with agronomists and ethnobotanists and so forth. And we'll talk about current activities in this project now. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks so much, Will. And it's been a great collaboration on this project. So what I'll talk about is the Food Prices for Nutrition project, which is the third generation of the projects that Daniel just described. This is now the kind of the third wave of this, moving towards mainstreaming the use of food prices for nutrition. And it's been wonderful to collaborate across disciplines and across sectors to look at, look with both economic and agricultural and also nutritional considerations on how to use data. And I was reflecting at the start of this session on Uma's remarks and interested, it really stuck out how she was saying that the scope of agricultural economics has changed since women have joined the field, and that women have often looked at different questions or the same questions in different ways. And I'm not in the field of agricultural economics. I studied agriculture and then studied nutrition. But reflecting on what Uma was saying, I think of my great-grandparents who 100 years ago, my great-grandfather was a professor of agricultural economics. My great-grandmother taught home economics at the same institution, which was Cornell University. And at that time, home economics was the domain of nutrition. Yeah. Economics did not concern itself with what people need to eat. That was the domain of women and of home economics. And then in home economics, they were not concerned with policy or systems impacts on food access. The systems like Meena was describing, they were mostly concerned with nutrition education and individual responsibility around food. With the first, the first USDA food guide coming out in World War II era, which was all about social protection and nutrition education. And so really with this project, Food Prices for Nutrition, we're using economic tools and understanding as a way to look at and understand access to nutritious diets for households and individuals. So bringing those two fields together, understanding that prices and affordability are a key driver of food choices and what people consume. And dietary guidelines are still used as a tool for nutrition education, but that all the nutrition education in the world will not change behavior if the food recommended is unaffordable, if those food environments don't facilitate individuals and households to be able to choose those nutritious diets. Next slide. So the vision of this project, as Daniel had introduced as well, is to use food prices for nutrition to match the aspiration, which was stated and agreed globally 25 years ago about food security, that food security is when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So this vision has been what governments and international agencies, and have striven for, and what scholars have studied, but really only partially until now, looking at food security mostly around calories, and later in terms of the experience of food insecurity. But now we bring in this element of economic access to nutritious food to meet dietary needs. Next slide. And our aim here is to look at, if you went to an average market in any country, how much would it actually cost to obtain nutritious food to meet dietary needs, to fulfill that vision of food security? And how many people could not afford that cost? Next slide. And to do this, as Professor Sarpong described, we use a variety of metrics. The one I'll focus on here is the cost of a healthy diet, which is identifying the cost of meeting dietary guidelines. Here you see a variety of dietary guidelines which have been published by different countries. And there are some differences, but overall there's a lot of similarity, mainly in the need for proportionality, diversity. The same food groups come up again and again. So when this is put forward as national policy, as a recommended healthy diet for all, really this is what people should be consuming as dietary needs for an active and healthy life. That's the purpose of these guidelines. So we want to know, who wouldn't be able to afford these. Is in many countries these are used for nutrition education, and how many people will be hearing that that education and not be able to act on it because they simply can't afford to eat diets that meet these guidelines. Next slide. So this is a different spin on how food prices have traditionally been used. I am just highlighting here the FAO Food Price Index as one of the indexes that have been used on global food prices. And this index is composed of a very small number of commodities. It includes several kinds of cereals, oils and fats, dairy, meat products, and sugar. And clearly that is very different from what we just saw on the last slide of diverse diets that would meet dietary needs. So this kind of an index is constructed around economically important commodities, but not around what people need to eat. And similarly, as we have just heard from the Ghana experience, market information systems don't always cover the foods that are needed, that are commonly consumed. And consumer price indexes are weighted by market value and say little about nutritional value. Next slide. So here what we've done is reweight the prices of foods and understanding the price of nutritious diet, and using the same food price data, and in some cases additional food items, as was collected by the Ghana Ministry of Food and Agriculture, to determine the cost of healthy diets. And there's, I want to highlight a source of food price data from the World Bank, the International Comparison Program, which is the only data source to have prices across all countries. And we've used this data set to look at affordability of healthy diets across countries. Next slide. So what we found looking at this data set with food prices around the world is that 3 billion people around the world globally are lacking sufficient income to purchase least cost healthy diets in the market. Least cost, so not necessarily the preferred items, but those items in the market that are the cheapest at each time and place. So this complements World Bank metrics for income poverty, where the international poverty line has been $1.90 a day. It joins other FAO metrics of food insecurity. So we were really happy that this metric was published in the UN report led by FAO, the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, last year, to join these other metrics of food insecurity on undernourishment, which is essentially lack of access to adequate calories. And you can see in the top map that there are still places where a lot of people cannot afford sufficient daily energy. It also joins the metric of the food insecurity experience scale of almost 2 billion people who are saying that they experience food insecurity, worry about food, for example. And this metric then shows that in addition, a lot of people, an additional billion people cannot afford healthy diets that would meet dietary guidelines. And you can see in Africa, that includes 829 million, which is far higher than other estimates of food insecurity when you consider the full definition of food to meet dietary needs. Next slide. So this sort of led to the logical conclusion that poverty lines could be based on healthy diet costs. If we're looking at the international poverty line of $1.90 and finding that that is very much insufficient to be able to afford a healthy diet, where the average cost globally was more like $3.75, then we're asking the question, should poverty lines be reconsidered so that they would at least cover access to a healthy diet? And we did a study using data from Myanmar showing that if we use dietary guidelines to construct poverty lines, that in this case, actually, coincidentally, the least cost of a healthy diet was actually about the same as the national poverty line. And then if we added in the additional cost of meeting food preferences among low-income consumers, in addition to just the pattern of the healthy diet that you see in the pie chart, that the cost went up further, as shown in the blue bar of the graph. So this is something that I think is worth discussing, considering in the economic community. What do we mean by basic needs? I would advocate that basic needs should at least cover the minimum cost of a healthy diet. And I think that's an agenda going forward to consider the meaning of poverty lines and where they ought to be set. Next. So our next steps in this project on food prices for nutrition, we essentially want to promote the use of food prices to measure diet costs and affordability, and to use these metrics to scale up monitoring and analysis within countries, as was described in the Ghana case, and also globally, working together with the World Bank to build a global system for monitoring food prices for nutrition, so that we have access to the type of data on diverse foods in each country, which is already collected, but that we would be able to bring that together to use in a monitoring system to have an indicator of whether people are able to access healthy diets, and then to extend the methods to new applications like modeling impact of policies. So on that last point, it sort of brings us to the question of, okay, so food prices are, in many places, the cost of a healthy diet is too high for many people to afford. So then what should be done about it? And there are many answers to that. Next slide. This returns to what Mina was saying about agricultural transformation for nutrition and health. There are many answers, and they're often very context specific. So for this, I want to just bring your attention to the Ag to Nut community practice. That's agriculture to nutrition community. And it was a community that began in 2010 with the aim to connect across disciplines to improve nutrition through agriculture and food systems. It includes people from all different disciplines. So agronomists, nutritionists, economists, programmers, social protection managers, anthropologists, to come together around this common question of how do we improve nutrition through agriculture and food systems. You can, if you're not already a member, you can join at the link shown there, agtonut.org. And several years ago, we came together as a community from many different fields and institutions to produce this 1.5 pages of very summarized principles on key recommendations for improving nutrition through agriculture and food systems. And these were things that come up time and time again in discussions around what can be done, different options that could work in different places. And a lot of them are closely tied to reducing the cost of nutritious food and healthy diets through different means. Next slide. And here, Often when we say that the cost of nutritious food, we need to work to reduce that. We've worked very hard to reduce the cost of calories and been very successful as a global community in the last 50 years. And now to turn our attention towards reducing that cost of nutritious food. A lot of times people misinterpret that call as somehow being regressive or, hitting producers and farmers to reduce the cost of food. And I just want to clarify here that, I think this is probably straightforward to economists, that we're not aiming to externalize costs. We're not aiming to lower food worker or agricultural wages. We're not aiming to recommend intensive production that discounts animal welfare or water quality, not aiming to cut forests and have major land use changes to produce more food. We're not aiming for trade protectionism. These would not be good ways to reduce the cost of nutritious food. The mechanisms that are the focus are investing in research, development of diverse foods, vegetables, fruits, legumes, seeds, increasing diversity in the food supply and viable opportunities for farmers, investing in environmentally and socially sustainable ways of producing animal source foods that are targeted for the poor, innovations in cold chains and other means of preservation, and market infrastructure to allow movement of products. And so I think there's a lot of common ground with a lot of the areas that economists work on, agricultural economists, all the time, that these are really important areas for understanding the best ways of reducing the cost of nutritious food at the same time as reducing poverty and increasing incomes. So I think this is where I want to end my remarks, but we need both sensibilities. We need the economic sensibility and the nutritional sensibility towards improving economic access to food. And also, I think later today in the discussions for the Food System Summit, you'll hear, if you join the next session, True Cost Accounting, to again talk further about the cost of food and not externalizing costs. But this has been really eye-opening for me to work with economists over the last several years, in particular, Will Masters. So Will, thanks again for convening this, and I'll turn it back to you.
Wonderful, thank you, Anna. Yeah, so this has been a great conversation in this session so far, of course, connecting to lots of other conversations. So Anna mentioned another side event that will happen this afternoon. Julia, perhaps you can find the link to that and enter it in the chat box, or Rachel could. There have been a number of great questions in the chat box and also using the Q&A feature. So I can share some of those, but I want to bring the conversation a little bit to the point that Lele entered in the chat box just now. What is an important message we should try to convey to the UN Food System Summit coming out of this side event? So in these dialogues, we produce a one-page summary of the conversation and report to the UN Food System Summit first of all, who came together, the demographic information from the poll, and then the identities from comments from the chat box, so as to contribute to this conversation that is happening all around the world. And in particular, I want to enter into the chat box a question that Jonas Chianu entered in the Q&A. So it's a bit of a long question, but the opening question is just what are agricultural economists doing outside of our traditional concerns on farm production to link agriculture to markets and nutrition? So I was hoping that people could enter in the chat box any project examples, any papers you've done, any initiatives that you know about that answer Jonas's question. So Jonas Chianu asked, right, what does the agricultural economics community do to link, to understand how farming and production links to food markets and nutrition? We've seen a few comments already about the food industry intervening with processing to offer these other products that are often more convenient, more delicious, heavily marketed, advertised, packaged in attractive ways. And the question is really what can be done to make these other things, healthy foods and so forth, more available, more at lower cost, and then potentially also the role of regulation. As you know, markets are everywhere regulated what you drive, how you build electrical appliances, housing, all those things are heavily regulated in terms of what can be done. And the food system is somewhat regulated, for example, with respect to trans fats or other aspects of ingredients that used to be thought of as okay and are now often banned or restricted. And so any kind of experience people might have, enter in the chat box just an example of a project, an initiative, maybe a paper, a publication that you could share from your universities, from your institutions around the world. While people are doing that, I want to pick up a question from Bhushana Karandikar, who asked whether there are certifications or standards that panelists could point to regarding, so Bhushana's question was specifically about water environmental footprints of agricultural commodities. We could also ask the same question about certifications or standards for the nutritional values of foods. So Guy Blaise might be able to comment on anything that the African Development Bank has been involved in, but I think other panelists might also have ideas about certifications and attempts to create standards that have been helpful. Any thoughts on those?
Really, yes. Maybe I will not go into detailed responses on what the African Development Bank is doing in certifications, because that is not really part of the work that African Development Bank is doing. But one thing that the bank is working on a lot is something that is even headed by Jonas Chan, who just asked one question here, is the project we call TAT, which is technology transformation and promotion on the continent. So the bank is trying to put a lot of resources through CGI centers to try to make technologies, bring technology, not only technology to farmers, but also bring technology to processors. So which can help to transform food for a better nutrition. So in doing so, different participants are working together with not only the farmers, but also the nutritionists to make sure that the kind of food that is put in the market is not only affordable, but also really touched to the point of bringing what type of food and what type of diet that is needed, depending of the region of the continent and depending on the kind of availability of food that exists in the region, be it in the north or in the south. Thank you. I will stop there.
Excellent. Very interesting. Yes, thank you. Any others want to comment on questions about certifications and standards?
Yeah, could I just jump in here? So I would like to distinguish between how we might conceptualize a water footprint, and I think there's a phenomenal amount of work that's already been done within the UN system, in fact, which tries to distinguish between a water footprint with giving it a color coding, whether it's blue or gray or whatever, which is an indication of what the plant or the agricultural product is using relative to how much is being lost to either the atmosphere or to the value chain as a whole. So there's also research that tries to connect those concepts of water footprints to nutrient water footprints that have all, but it's largely in the research area. So while I think there's a lot of interest in trying to come up with at least a color coding of what we might consider to be more water intensive and less water intensive, there are two things I want to mention. The first is that to the extent that crop requirements of water vary by region and even within a region across different kinds of input regimes, mapping that to data, actual data, is a challenge. Serious efforts, at least not that I'm aware of, to try and collect data on that. And the second component of that is the question of water safety. There is a lot of research, of course, as many of you know, on groundwater contamination. by arsenic is perhaps the most well understood, but by other heavy minerals as well. But again, to map that at a global scale and what implications it has for agriculture, there isn't, as far as I'm aware, a good database that tracks that, but there's certainly a lot of interest in documenting this.
Fascinating, yes. And I wanted to flag also a kind of related question to what Jonas Chianu asked about certification for environmental aspects. There's also, of course, standards and certification for nutritional and health aspects of food. So I'm very curious if anybody wants to share any examples of perhaps some successful efforts in their country to perhaps regulate out harmful foods, and also to put encouraging messages, kind of traffic light systems with a green for healthy foods and a red for unhealthy foods and an orange for limited foods. Are there any examples of certifications or standards that you would want to flag? I remember vividly working with Daniel in Accra on visiting the Food Research Institute in Ghana and the Food Standards Agency, and talking about their ability and limited ability to actually test foods for these nutritional characteristics that we were looking for possible certification of. And I would expect that at least some of you have some experience with efforts to just reveal what's in foods, which of course is not visible, it can't be tasted, can't be smelled, people don't know what's in the foods. It needs a laboratory to test and identify. And that's something I'm curious if anybody has any experience with, please enter in the chat box. So Jenny Lapina has mentioned about grocery stores in the Philippines having a green light with a label of healthy food. Interesting, thank you. So panelists, as we think about key messages that Uma asked us to focus on, and I agree, we definitely want to convey something from this group for the UN Food System Summit dialogues and these scientific side events. Panelists, are there key messages you think we should highlight?
Can I say something?
Please, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in the book that is coming out of mine, we show that there is really no relationship between the World Bank's documentation of decline in poverty and decline in hunger, even when hunger is defined very simply as calorie availability. Hunger hasn't declined as much as the World Bank said the poverty has declined. And as you know, in the context of India, there's been much debate about whether the poverty line that the bank chose is an adequate poverty line for saying the world is free of poverty. I mean, in 2010, the bank declared that the world was free of poverty. But if you look at the actual numbers, you find that that's fooling oneself. So I think one of the questions is, should the UN Food Summit have a higher ambition on what poverty line is and how does that relate to hunger and malnutrition in a more general way, asking a broader question about whether we need to reassess the poverty lines. Because I think a paper I published in Economic and Political Weekly shows that even $3.5 doesn't get you enough nutritious food. It's $5.5 which enables you to have nutritious food. So I think the whole question of the poverty and hunger baselines and what's acceptable really needs to be reassessed in the context of the UN Food Summit. That's one thing. The second is, I think very few countries have certification laws, and even those that do, they're never really implemented in any serious way. So they remain on paper, but there isn't much of a significance to that. And that you can see even in the US, for instance, which is a very advanced country. And the third issue I found in my book was that the lobbying by the private sector food companies to not allow nutrition standards to be enforced and popularized is very substantial. And for some reason, the agricultural economics profession has not addressed that question of the role of the private sector. We often talk about it. We don't talk about the negative impacts of the role of the private sector and what needs to happen. In Europe, it's, as you know, there's much stronger regulation than in the US. And I document through stories from New York Times of many countries, Brazil, Malaysia, etc., to show this lobbying effort by the private sector. And I'm hoping that the UN food system addresses these questions and not just kind of motherhood and apple pie ambitions which don't get realized because of the reality of the political economy of policy making in developing countries, in all countries, not just developing countries.
Yes, thank you. And this point about political mobilization and lobbying, it's absolutely essential for civil society and for academics, for researchers, to have the kind of community, the lobbying, the pressure, the communication, the conversations that I hope this is part of and the Food System Summit is part of. The US versus Europe in terms of food system regulation, how that evolved in the 19th and 20th century is an extraordinary story where the United States did have very progressive food regulation, was the first to do so, to have mandatory disclosure, to regulate the contents, to ensure that what was sold was actually what was said. Europe was far behind in the early 20th century with lots more food fraud in Europe than in the United States, lots more food safety violations in Europe. And companies in the United States would go bankrupt. People would go, recently to prison for violations of food laws. And that didn't happen in Europe, but now that's switched. The United States, as you know, has fallen behind in terms of our own democracy, our own accountability, and we have to rebuild those institutions here, demonstrating the real need for civic engagement to make these conversations actually work. We have enough time maybe to consider a slightly different topic. Arega Eleni in the Q&A box entered a very interesting question about key messages for the Food System Summit. I just typed it into the chat box so everyone can see it in the chat box. And he was asking, to what extent can low-income people, can the poor, depend on markets to acquire nutritious food? To what extent should we focus on markets and trade as economists versus focusing on safety nets and food assistance? Do any panelists have comments on that balance between markets and trade versus, for example, in the Indian context, ration shops and government procurement? Any thoughts on markets and trade versus direct assistance?
So I can try and address that a little bit by first saying that this is in response to the COVID pandemic, where many state governments and indeed the central government ensured that basic food supplies would be available for free. There was some controversy over targeting criteria, but by and large, the idea was whoever needed free rations would be entitled to get them. And it was originally for a period of about 6 months. So this, however, included wheat, rice, lentils, and vegetable oil, but that's about it. Yeah. So that's, we sort of set that as a first point. Also to note that it isn't as if there wasn't discussion of extending this in particular to milk, not so much to fruits and vegetables, but that in countries where supply systems are not necessarily have a cold chain, this is easier said than done. So urban consumers actually had a much easier time accessing more nutritious products than rural areas. The second way that I want to address that is that this is research that has been done based on 4 surveys on this question of what is happening with variability, and COVID, of course, was an extreme. Well, not COVID so much, but the lockdowns that were enforced as a consequence COVID that sort of disrupted supply chains, whether it was for grain or not, even though those were exempted, suggests that the evidence is somewhat mixed. So in rural areas of states which had relatively good infrastructure, by which I mean road infrastructure, they were in some ways worse hit because of the fact that there were higher prices that they had to pay for getting nutritious foods, but that seems to have been of a relatively short duration. What the evidence seems to suggest is, yes, it was difficult for a couple of months, but then as supply sort of eased, then things were starting to come back to normal. And then you have the other extreme of areas which are not so well developed in terms of road infrastructure, especially in tribal areas, for instance, where people actually went back to the forests to try and get access non-grain sources of food. So you might plausibly argue that places that weren't served by markets perhaps were protected in terms of a nutritious diet by relying on traditional sources of fruits and vegetables and wild nuts and berries. But then I should note that this is only one study that does this comparison. So it does seem to suggest that market infrastructure can help because you have to have a mechanism to get things to people. And I don't just mean roads, I also mean market infrastructure in terms of cold stores, et cetera, et cetera. It's not clear to me that the tribal example of going back to the forest to get a more varied diet is necessarily a sustainable one, but I don't know enough about it to comment.
I'd like to add to Dr. Mina's remarks on that, that we know in rural areas, which mainly have agricultural communities, that the market is a very important source of the more diverse foods, that people tend to be more self-sufficient on the grains and the pulses, and they if they happen to have a cow on the dairy. But for the fruits and vegetables and certainly oils, people are relying on markets. So I think that suggests two things, and they're both related to exactly what you were saying. One is that we need attention to better connectivity in markets so that people can successfully access diversity in markets. And at the same time, we need to recognize that that is a long-term agenda, that markets are not well connected in a lot of places, and that turning to wild sources of food and home-produced sources of food is very important in a lot of contexts. It's definitely not just one context as coming from a background in plant science and ethnobotany. There are many, many communities who depend on the wild for diversity, and that's the linkage between food security and food sovereignty, that people have access to finding their own sources of food when the market doesn't deliver. So yes, markets should be more connected in the process towards that long-term agenda. Social protection needs to have a scope to protect wild areas and also to encourage home production of diverse foods in home gardens, as not just agriculture, but as social protection. And I think that links to, I want to underscore Uma's first point of messages for the UN Food System Summit, very simply to be consistent. We have for 25 years agreed that food security is access to nutritious food to meet dietary needs. We need to be consistent and understand where that's feasible. I think the best way to monitor that is through markets, at the same time recognizing that markets are not the only source of food, but to be able to have an understanding of basic needs broadened to that basic needs really mean access to diverse, nutritious diets.
Excellent. And that is a great point to end on. So we are out of time, but I really appreciate the conversation so far in the chat box, in the Q&A. And I am sure that this conversation can and will continue through the African Association, through the International Association, through the Science Days. This is a science side event for Food System Summit events happening tomorrow and the next day, and that each one of you is able to really use the tools that you have to speak up, to understand, and to act on the food system as we've discussed. So thanks so much for joining. Thanks to all of our panelists.
Thank you, Will. Thank you for organizing this. Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Will.
Scott. Thanks to everybody. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you all.